Okay, so we're taking off with Cold War Part 3. This is the background of Vietnam. The French controlled Vietnam in the 1800s up until World War II. Ho Chi Minh led a communist revolution who were upset the French controlled Vietnam, and war broke out after World War II between the Vietnamese and France. Alright, so as the French and Vietnamese fought, the U.S. was fighting the Cold War and the spread of communism in Europe, and now they felt like they had to fight it in Asia. President Truman is the president at the time. So the U.S. helped the French by giving money in 1950 to the French to help them defeat the communist Vietnamese who had risen up to overthrow them. However, France could not beat the Viet Minh, who were the name of the Vietnamese communist soldiers. So they met at the Geneva Conference in Geneva, Switzerland, and they agreed to split Vietnam in the 17th parallel, which is where that comes into the song. That's how you get North and South of Vietnam. North becomes communist, South becomes anti-communist. So the North communist was led by Ho Chi Minh. The anti-communist in the South was led by Dien Diem. All right, Ho Chi Minh was loved by the Vietnamese, and Diem wasn't. They absolutely hated him. Even though he was supported by the United States, the Vietnamese did not love him, and the United States still chose to support him. He was actually very harsh and never even started democracy, and we'll get to him later. So JFK becomes president in 1960. We have now an issue with the communism spreading to Cuba because Fidel Castro has come to power in Cuba and he has aligned himself with the Soviets. So JFK orders the Bay of Pigs invasion in April of 1961. All right, the U.S. used Cuban exile soldiers and trained them using U.S. military strategy to invade Cuba and try to overthrow this new leader called Fidel Castro in Cuba, who was aligning himself with the communist Soviets. The Cubans crushed the invasion. They knew about it ahead of time, or at least parts of it ahead of time, and it embarrassed the U.S. and JFK immensely. So now the Berlin Wall was being built. Many East Berliners were fleeing to the United States side, or the United States controlled West Berlin. So the Soviets threatened to close off West Berlin access to the United States because it was technically in their part of Germany they had divided up after World War II. JFK insisted that West Berlin remain independent. And so in August 1961, the Soviet Union and East Germany built the Berlin Wall that divided the independent West Berlin and the communist East Berlin. So that's where the Berlin Wall came from. The wall was a symbol of communist oppression, and when it fell eventually, which we'll get to later, it was a huge success for the United States government and a huge sign of the changing times. Another big issue that JFK had to deal with Cuba and the communists and Fidel Castro and the Soviets was the Cuban Missile Crisis. All right, the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, all right, in Cuba thought the U.S. was planning a second attack on Cuba, and the Soviets and the communists and the Soviets and the Cubans did not want that attack, obviously. So the Soviets decided to build weapon facilities in Cuba, which they were going to stock with nuclear warheads. Well, the U.S. got word of this, and that's not going to fly. All right, so JFK planned a blockade of Cuba to prevent the USSR ships from sailing into Cuban waters and dropping off those nuclear warheads. So if the nuclear warheads had been assembled in Cuba that close, they would have only taken minutes before they could have landed in the United States and done a lot of damage. Ultimately, the USSR agreed to remove the missiles if the United States agreed not to attack or invade Cuba, which they both did, and we were able to avoid this Cuban Missile Crisis. I can't imagine what could be worse. Fighting Navy ships in the middle of, the Atlantic Ocean, some stocked with bombs, the others stocked with nuclear warheads. No matter how that Cuban Missile Crisis would have went down, this went down in probably the best way it could have. All right, Vietnam trouble escalates, so now we're back in Vietnam and we're focusing on that spread of communism, preventing it from going around. Like I said earlier, Diem did not make South Vietnam democratic like he said he would. He was very corrupt guy, very evil guy, pretty much a dictator as well. The South Vietnamese joined with the South Vietnamese communists to form the Viet Cong, so now you had communists in South Vietnam fighting against South Vietnam, and they were working to overthrow Diem. All right, North Vietnam supported them, and they sent supplies down what is called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was a secret trail coming through the jungle, a little bit into Cambodia, and that's how they were able to supply the Viet Cong. So South Vietnam was not only fighting North Vietnamese soldiers, but they were fighting their own people in their own country called the Viet Cong. The U.S. upped its support with troops and money in 1963, but JFK had lost faith in Diem, and he planned a coup to have him overthrown. Well, the leaders of that coup ended up killing Diem, even though JFK told them not to. All right, JFK was ultimately assassinated 3 weeks later. It was a huge tragedy. You should ask your grandparents, maybe some of your parents, maybe some of your grandparents about it. I guarantee you they remember where they were when this happened. But he was assassinated 3 weeks after he okayed that coup. And Lyndon B. Johnson became president, and he immediately increased U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War because they're focusing on preventing the spread of communism. So the Vietnam War continues to escalate. South Vietnam could not hold off, could not hold off North Vietnam and the Viet Cong in the beginning. So the communists controlled a lot of South Vietnam. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which was basically a resolution that gave President Johnson the ability to use military force. It wasn't a declaration of war, but President Johnson could enforce military tactics in Vietnam to help the South Vietnamese. Violence and troops numbers escalated immediately. By the end of 1968, there were 536,000 troops in Vietnam, American soldiers. So many soldiers were young and inexperienced. The terrain was a harsh, dense jungle full of plants. Communist soldiers used guerrilla warfare like underground tunnels, booby traps, landmines, stuff like that. And the U.S. enemy was very persistent. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese were fighting for what they believed to be right. And so they were not going to give in to the United States just because the United States was there. They felt the United States just represented France, who they had just gotten rid of not too long ago. All of those conditions right there led to the U.S. soldiers having a hard time fighting and defeating the communist soldiers. So the U.S. used napalm, which is a gasoline jelly-type bomb that was very flammable. Agent Orange, which is the chemical that destroyed plants in parts of the jungle. And the search and destroy missions, where they sought out towns where Viet Cong lived to destroy them all. There were very harsh strategies for the United States, things that a lot of people maybe didn't agree with at the time. On January 30th and 31st, which is my birthday, January 31st, the communists launched the Tet Offensive, designed to surprisingly attack U.S. bases and cities. It was a military defeat for the North Vietnamese communists, though, because they lost a lot of men. However, it did surprise the United States. All right, it surprised the United States, and the people back home began to question the war and question their government. They're like, why are we over there losing all these men? What are we even fighting for? Who cares if they're communists over here? We're in America. You know, they were questioning that. People began to protest the war publicly and protest the draft because more African Americans and lower class Americans were being sent to the war than middle and upper class. They viewed it as racist and classist, if you will. A lot of prejudices in this draft. Plus, you only had to be 18 to be drafted, but you couldn't vote till 21. So people were saying, hey, why am I allowed to fight for my government when I can't vote for my government? So that became a big issue. So a new lifestyle emerges, and the war starts to wind down. The war turned some young people against the middle classes and the corporations, the government, and they were considered, going against the man, if you will, and these people were called hippies. They were known as a counterculture movement during this time, during the 70s, late 60s and 70s. President Johnson began to back off the Vietnam War altogether and wanted to negotiate for peace. He eventually knew that he wasn't going to win the next election, so he chose not to run. Nixon won the 1968 presidential election and promised to end the Vietnamese War honorably, get us out successfully. So in the spring of 1969, Nixon announced Vietnamization, which is the gradual withdrawal of troops out of Vietnam. But he did start to bomb Cambodia, which tried to cut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which is how the Viet Cong were getting their supplies from North Vietnamese. And that angered the Americans, and they felt betrayed. Hang on one second, I just realized I forgot the board. So that's our last board here. Sorry, I didn't have it up there. The Vietnam War ends. Nixon won re-election by promising peace this time. On January 27th, 1973, in Paris, the South Vietnamese and the United States met with the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, and they declared a ceasefire. No more firing. On March 29th, the U.S. brought home all their troops, and the North Vietnam immediately attacked South Vietnam and won the city of Saigon, and they were able to make Vietnam all communist country. America did send money to help them, but obviously no troops were there. Thousands of people were killed and injured during this battle. The Vietnamese landscape was absolutely ruined. The 26th Amendment was passed, which lowered the voting age to 18 to make it more fair if you're going to fight. You need to make sure that you can vote for your government as well. And the war changed many things in America, like trust in your government, war strategy, leadership, how politicians ran in elections. It was a huge shift in our country, and that is the end of the Vietnam War.